Executive Director of Idaho Solutions. Welcome to tonight's event. This is the fourth installment of the More You Know lecture series. So we're happy to have all of you here. This series that we have is designed to inform and engage Idahoans on critical issues impacting our state. This series will expand statewide with a few topics in the fall, providing valuable insights and fostering a deeper understanding of issues throughout Idaho. Our next lecture after tonight will be September 22nd at 7 p.m. That will be with Keith Allred, who is the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that works to build our nation's capacity to engage in differences constructively. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the LA Times, The Hill, and Congressional Quarterly. You may recognize his name because he used to call Twin Falls home, and he's a graduate of Twin Falls High School. His lecture is Beyond the Noise, Why Civil Discourse Still Matters. And for that lecture, and then the one in October, we'll be back at the Harrett Center in the Rick Allen Room. If you didn't pick up a flyer on your way in, there are flyers out there that you can pick up that tell the information for September and October. So I'd encourage you to pick those up so you have that information. Tonight's event is sponsored by Idaho Solutions, along with Mormon Women for Ethical Government and Boise State Public Radio. So we appreciate our co-sponsors tonight. All of tonight's sponsors have tables out in the lobby, and if you didn't have a chance to stop by, you can do that on your way out tonight and just learn a little bit more about each organization. As we do with all of our lectures, we will have plenty of time for questions tonight. If you have a question, we have index cards. If you didn't pick one up when you came in, you can just raise your hand and we have some people that will get you the index card. And then what we're going to do tonight, because we don't have a center row, we'll just have you pass your card whichever side you're closest to, and we have people that will collect the cards, and they'll bring them to me, and then when we get to the Q&A, I'll bring them over to our speakers. So I have had a couple people ask if they'll be able to watch this online. There were some people who couldn't come that asked if we were recording it. We are recording it. We put the recordings out about a week after the lecture. They're on the Idaho Solutions YouTube channel, and then we also put them on our website. So you can go back and re-listen, but you can also tell your friends and family who wanted to be here and couldn't be here that they can watch it in about a week. So tonight's lecture is Extremely American, How Christian Nationalism is Changing Politics in Idaho and DC, and I think you're in for a real treat. Brian Johns will be moderating tonight, and thank you, Brian, for agreeing to do that. I'll introduce Brian, and then I'll introduce Heath. Brian Johns is a fifth-generation Magic Valley resident. He's an occupational health physician at St. Luke's and also serves as a medical director in the St. Luke's Health System. He is a member of the Times News editorial board. He has a passion for interfaith work, including teaching, fostering friendships, and interfaith peace building. And then sitting next to Brian is Heath Drusen, our guest speaker. Thank you, Heath, for making the trip to Twin Falls. We appreciate him being here. Heath Drusen is an award-winning reporter and podcaster who covers extremism, politics, and the environment. His series, Extremely American, looks at the intersection between extremist groups and mainstream politics. His latest podcast, Howl, looks at 30 years of wolf reintroduction in the West. He has reported for outlets such as NPR, BBC, and the Daily Beast. Previously, he spent more than 6 years as a war correspondent in Iraq and Afghanistan for Stars and Stripes. When Heath is not reporting, and even occasionally when he is, he enjoys backpacking, snowboarding, and fly fishing. You can listen to Extremely American and Howl everywhere that you find podcasts or on boisestatepublicradio.org.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and especially thank Heath for coming over and spending the night with us to talk with us about this important topic. And so, for starters, I was wondering we're going to talk about Christian nationalism. So I want to understand why you use that term and sort of what it means. And so maybe just set the stage for us.
Yeah, no, that's a really important first question. And first of all, just thank you guys for coming out here on a Thursday night and having such a great crowd. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be in Twin Falls. I've given a few of these talks, but I haven't been down in the Magic Valley yet. So it's great to be here and talk about this. What is Christian nationalism? That's a good question. And reasonable people might disagree about the definitions. I try to keep it fairly simple. For me, someone who is a Christian nationalist is someone who wants the country to be explicitly Christian, which means basically their interpretation of the Bible should be the underpinning of government explicitly. The laws should be based on the Bible. And the folks that I've talked to for the podcast, they are pretty open about wanting theocracy. So they want a religious government. And they don't just mean a government that, has some biblical foundations. They want it to be the law. And I do want to be really clear. I think this is important and sometimes gets misinterpreted. My podcast is not about Christianity. This is not, Christians are trying to turn the country into a theocracy. Christian nationalism is a very specific movement. And if you do listen to the podcast, you'll see the folks I talk to have a very narrow definition of who is Christian, which we'll get into a bit later. So yeah, it is a podcast about Christian nationalism, which is not, does not mean that, it's casting a wide net over all of Christianity. And the other thing I want to say is that it's also a term that the folks I talk to kind of embrace. They use it proudly very often. So it's not meant to be a pejorative, it's meant to be a descriptive, and one that often the folks that I'm reporting on use themselves to describe themselves.
Great, thank you, appreciate that. So maybe along those lines, there might be people here today who say, what, I love Jesus and I love my country. Does that mean I'm a Christian nationalist? Can you kind of explain the difference maybe a little bit more between being a Christian who loves his or her country and being a Christian nationalist?
Right, yeah, absolutely. If you're a devout Christian and you're patriotic, that doesn't mean you're a Christian nationalist. You might be, I don't know what your beliefs are. But no, the big difference is that Christian nationalists do not believe in the separation of church and state. They want the church to be intertwined with the government in a very, very direct way. And that means so many different things. It starts to mean that, there's religious tests for office, which is something explicitly that's not allowed under our Constitution. They would argue differently, and they do. But yeah, no, those two things, not the same at all. You really have to have a very, I would say, a very novel view of the church's role in government to be a Christian nationalist, and that would mean that basically your interpretation of Christianity is going to inform all the laws of the land.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm sure we'll get more into that, and I have some more questions for you about that, but I want to, tell us how you got here. So you have this podcast, how'd you end up in Idaho talking to Christian nationalists, and one of your seasons was about militia, and so how did you get here, and they're probably not a group that, I wouldn't think that they'd like to talk to journalists, and so how did you get here, and how did you get to talk to them?
So I actually first got to Idaho in 2005. So I've been in and out of the state for 20 years now. But how I got into this specifically, this kind of stuff was always like kind of bubbling around, and I was interested in these movements. But in 2018, I came back to work on this 2-year collaboration between a bunch of public radio stations on the role of guns in American life. And I started looking at the militia movement and how foundational gun rights are to them. And I just saw a big change in Idaho, which was sort of at the leading edge of this in the country, where militia leaders and militia sympathizers kind of went from kind of the fringes to, I started seeing them in the Capitol and like talking to lawmakers and, having warm receptions. And I was like, oh, okay, something's changed. Like they're being more embraced, and not only that, they're becoming important. They're actually like, they're being influential. So that just sort of set me off on a journey. And then the program ended, and I needed to do some more work. So that was good motivation to figure something else out.
Right.
But that set me on the path to do Extremely American and look more deeply into militia groups. And that was all right before January 6th. I was like, I think these guys are becoming more important. January 6th happened, kind of in the middle of production, and I was like, oh, okay, well, I think there might be some interest in this.
Yeah.
And that kind of just, obviously we've seen how the politics of Idaho and America have gone. Certainly there's been a lot more influence of far-right ideas and far-right groups. They've been mainstreamed. And so I've continued with the series now and continued with the coverage because I think it remains important and dynamic. Like it's changing, right? Different ideas are, different ideas are becoming important, and and I think it's just getting more and more relevant every day.
How'd you talk to people who you had to know that not everything you said they would have loved, but on your podcast, but somehow they trusted you to talk and share part of their story.
Yeah, I'll be honest, like, especially when I started season 2 about Christian nationalism, what we're talking about tonight, my big fear was that I was going to have to fill in a lot of gaps because nobody would talk to me. These, obviously Christian nationalists, people in militias, they're not, on balance at least, the most media-friendly people. They're very skeptical, and sometimes for good reason. I'll say that. Sometimes we as journalists get things wrong and maybe don't get the nuances of some of these movements. But almost everybody talked to me. That was a big surprise, a pleasant surprise. And I'd like to say it was just my charm and persuasion.
Probably mostly, yeah. I've just spent the last couple hours with you, definitely.
And that would be nice. But I think there's two much more important reasons. One is something that I do. I do try to be extremely honest with them up front. I say, you're not going to like everything that I write. Not going to like everything that you hear in the podcast. You're going to hate some of it. But I'm going to give you a chance to tell your story. I'm going to get your perspective in there. And on these big projects, I have the luxury of being able to say, and it's not just going to be a soundbite. Like, you're going to be able to explain yourself at length, which I have done. And hopefully I've done that effectively, because I do want people to understand where they're coming from. I don't want to just tell people about these groups. So I think that helps, just being upfront that, it's going to be a mixed bag for you. The other thing is that they frankly, they're proud of what they're doing, and they think they're on the right side of history. I think they think that they can persuade listeners. And maybe that's true for some listeners. Some of them, I think they can persuade me too. I've definitely run into situations where it feels like I'm being sort of kind of lobbied, which is fine. But yeah, I mean, mainly, like, I think they want people to know their story because they're not hiding it anymore. And crucially, they think they're winning when they're not wrong right now. There's certainly the groups that I've covered in the last 2 seasons have much more power and have much more influence and are much more accepted in certain political spheres right now than they were just a few years ago. So
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, fascinating. I loved your podcast. I thought it was very interesting, just fascinating, especially since season 2 is really centered largely in Idaho. And so you spent a lot of time in Moscow in particular, a lot of time with members of Christ Church and with their leader, Doug Wilson. And so I want to ask you maybe just how does a pastor of a relatively small church in Moscow, Idaho, become so influential in the movement?
Right. Why do we care about this
Yeah.
pastor of a church in a town of 26,000 people?
Right.
And that's because he's become arguably the most prominent Christian nationalist thinker in the country. And the way he's done that is, he has by American standards, a relatively small church in a relatively small town, but he's built this media and education empire. He's been extremely savvy about that. And he's got reach well beyond Moscow. So his Association of Classical Christian Schools, they have hundreds of schools across the country, coast to coast, and they've been really influential in Christian education. And they're kind of all along the lines of his pretty severe interpretation of the Bible. And so you've got an education pipeline right there. He's got a college now. He's had it for a number of years, actually, up in Moscow, New St. Andrews. And his whole thing is, and again, this is him telling me, he wants to create essentially an army for spiritual warfare, as he calls it. So he wants to educate people from the beginning through college in his vision, so they can go out and do important things in government, in the legal world. He said, I want to have Supreme Court justices and prominent authors. He wants to change the culture. The other thing he does, obviously, is he has churches. So he's got his church in Moscow, but he's got an umbrella group of churches around the country, similar to his school system. So they're not all, obviously, as he says, he's not like the all-powerful dictator of his churches, so they're different, but they all come from the same sort of Christian nationalist perspective as him. And then maybe, arguably, the most important is his publishing arm. So he has this, he's really got a kind of multimedia empire right now, where he's got books, he's got streaming shows, he's got kids programming. He's really kind of trying to create a parallel universe where you can spend all your time in Christchurch world, school, church, media, all of it. And that's been hugely powerful because he's really influenced people around the country with these shows. And they're good. They're slick marketing. They're good production values. These aren't just sort of cheap, cheap, bad-looking shows that aren't edited well. They're slick.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Can you give us, so if you, as you describe, or as he, I guess his words, the spiritual army that he's trying to, what kind of changes or would Doug Wilson and maybe people in this movement like to see in America? Can you give us maybe some examples of what they wish it would look like?
Yeah, they want to fundamentally change the entire way the country works.
Like how so? Give us some examples.
They want to upend democracy, and a big part of that is they don't think women should vote. So, and they're very, and again, you know, this is, they're not shy about it. They told me, they said this into my mic. If you listen to the program, that's the biggest thing, right? They want to basically disenfranchise 50% of America. And there's sort of a Christian nationalist jargon term that they use. They call it household voting. So they say basically, well, everybody will get their say at the dinner table. Basically, the husband will consult with his wife, and they'll make a decision as a family. But of course, you know, my follow-up was, okay, but the husband actually votes. Well, yes. So if you hear household voting, what that means is women don't get to vote. There are a couple exceptions. If you wait long enough and your husband dies first, then you're technically the head of the household, and then Doug Wilson might let you vote. And yeah, I know it sounds a little funny, but they have like very specific rules for this. Yeah, so yeah, that's a big one. The other big one is that they want to make voting harder. There's some different ideas, but I mean, a very common one batted around was they want to get back to needing to own land to vote. Like, they want fewer people to vote. So that's big. Other things they want to do, there would be, it's interesting because they talk a lot about free speech, but there would be quite a lot of censorship in their view, because things that were against Christianity would potentially be censored. You know, you wouldn't have, well, obviously, this seems obvious, I think, but they would ban pornography, and that's by far not the most controversial thing they would do. But then from there, you know, I asked them, like, well, what about, you know, things that you see as blasphemous? And they're like, well, yeah. And what does that mean? Well, I mean, that's sort of in the eye of the beholder, but if they're in charge, it's in their eye. And I think we'll get to it a little bit later, but they would have pretty severe restrictions on who could hold office as well.
Okay, I was just going to ask you about that. When I was at one point during season 2 in your podcast, you were talking to a Christian nationalist. I don't remember who it was, but he was in Idaho, I believe, and he basically point blank said that because of your religion, he didn't believe you should be able to hold public office, and go with on that. I mean, so who's in the Christian nationalist view of Doug Wilson and his followers? Who's in and who's out? I mean, who gets to define who a Christian is? Who can have power? Who can have influence? Who can vote? Stuff like that.
Right, and I think that's something that that a lot of folks maybe don't understand. It's that most people are out. You know, I know a lot of folks here are Christian, but that doesn't necessarily mean you fit into the Christian nationalist idea for America. So what he was talking about was, you know, I was talking to a guy named Gabe Wrench, who's a kind of like the media guru of Doug Wilson's orbit, and he has a show called Cross Politic that he's a co-host of. And I was talking to Gabe, and yeah, he said that non-Christians can't hold office, and I said, as a Jewish American, I find that terrifying. And he said, well, your worldview is bad for America. Which, you know, on the one hand, I was like, that's pretty rough. On the other hand, I was kind of like, I'm glad you said that into my microphone, at least got it. It's audio gold. But it doesn't end with me. Obviously, if you're Muslim, if you're Hindu, if you're atheist, and you admit it at least, you're out. If you're Catholic, you are not in. If you're Mormon, which I think is something you know, in Idaho that a lot of folks would be interested in, you are also out. And they actually had some really, I wish we had more of this in the podcast because I think it's really important, but they have a pretty dim view of Mormons. Doug Wilson told me that he thinks they're apostates. He actually said Mormons are polytheistic, which I know Mormons are not. And so he doesn't consider Mormons Christian. He doesn't consider Catholics Christian. And I'm just scratching the surface here. I think you're getting the idea that they consider a very narrow band of Protestant belief systems as acceptable to them, which means that you wouldn't be able to be represented. You wouldn't be able to represent your community in government, and it's not America, right? It's not the America we know. So that's why when I say they want to fundamentally uproot democracy, they do. And they'll also tell you they don't really like democracy. Again, it's not meant to be like pejorative. It's what they say.
Wow, okay. Thank you. So just the line, basically, some are in, pretty much everyone else is out. That's kind of like in a summary.
Say it again.
A few people are in and a lot of other people are out.
Yeah, I mean, you would basically have to have a pretty strict religious test for office, and depending on who you talk to for voting. And if you don't pass that,
you'd be out.
Then you're out.
Okay.
They say you can be a citizen, but you don't have full citizenship, in my view, at least.
Yeah. Okay.
And the other interesting thing is they also one of the things Gabe told me after he said it, my worldview is bad for America and I shouldn't be able to hold office, is that, but I'd still like it better. I'd still like,
you would still like it better.
I'd like life under them better. And I think they believe that. And I think that's, that was a little wild to me.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to go back to something you said about women, women not voting. And I noticed that was a theme, I think, of kind of patriarchy, and I can't remember, there's maybe another term for it, but can you talk a little bit about the role of women in this movement, or how women fit into this movement? Yeah, I mean,
one thing I learned that I don't think I fully appreciated was that a patriarchal society for them, a strict patriarchal society where men are the leaders and women are mainly at home, is foundational to their belief. They think society is crumbling because there's too many women in positions of power. They use their term, gynocracy. They say that we've become a gynocracy. I know, but if you'll hear it if you kind of go down the rabbit hole of Christian nationalist media, you'll hear it a lot. And they talk about the feminization of the country and how that's basically led to, in their mind, kind of a Sodom and Gomorrah. They think that we need to get back to women's roles being very restricted. And I think that's another thing that I didn't fully understand how foundational that was. I didn't fully appreciate before I did this reporting how much they wanted to cut women out of society. But yeah, I mean, if you come away with one thing tonight, I mean, it's the fact that they do want to disenfranchise 50% of the country, and not only that, they want to severely restrict kind of what you can do in society in general. But certainly you can't be president. So.
Okay, thank you. Idaho, I've seen described alternatively as a sort of a laboratory for extremism, or also as an epicenter for Christian nationalism. Maybe you kind of already explained some of that because you said Doug Wilson's so influential, but can you maybe explain why you think that is the case? Why is Idaho a magnet for this?
I think there's different reasons for different groups, but I think Idaho is attractive to extremist groups for a couple reasons. One, there's a lot of space and you can kind of fly under the radar. You can kind of go do your own thing. out of the, like, there's not a lot of rules. I mean, some of the things that I think a lot of us like about Idaho. There's space to kind of go do your own thing and not be bothered. I think another reason is people like Doug Wilson are super savvy about having achievable goals. They want to win. And I think people like him and other far-right groups, they see Idaho as small enough to be winnable. We don't have a huge population. You can go into communities, and if you're really organized and dogged about it, then you can change things. That's why you see them going after like local boards, library boards, city councils, school boards, things like that. Not just in Idaho, but around the country. So yeah, that's that group. I mean, militia groups definitely like to be left alone and have a lot of space to go roam, do training, not be bothered. Idaho's very attractive for that. And then when you get to the much more radical racist right, you obviously have a history of the Aryan nations here. No surprise, they like Idaho because it's pretty white. And they can disappear. All the other stuff, plus it's very white, and they see it as a possible homeland for them. Now, I'm not conflating the militia groups I talked to and Doug Wilson with the Aryan nations. Don't get me wrong. I'm just talking about the breadth of radical groups here. They're all very different.
Okay, great. No, thank you. I want to come back to maybe Christchurch specifically and the intersection with politics. You kind of just touched on it, and so it made me think of that again. But how do they figure into politics? Maybe start with Idaho, and then maybe go nationally after that. Like, how does this movement fit in with Idaho politics and national politics? Yeah,
I mean, Christchurch is interesting because they haven't actually had much success at getting their own people elected. They tried a little bit, but it didn't really work. Moscow's actually a pretty liberal town, as a lot of you probably know. So it's, but there's two things. The more intangible one is that Doug Wilson's been really good at getting his message across in the state and nationally, like influencing through his media. And doing it in a way, I was talking to somebody before this talk. What they've really done is sort of amazingly make fundamentalists, like radical fundamentalism counterculture. They've really they branded it in this way where they've made it, being a rebel is joining us, which sort of flips that on its head from what we've known in America or what we've thought in America for a long time. So there's that sort of intangible cultural change where he influences it through shows and books, etc. The other thing they do is they kind of dominate the Idaho Family Policy Center. I don't think a lot of people know that. They're a pretty influential group, and I think they're becoming more influential in state policy. They have a pretty Christian nationalist agenda, and they haven't got everything they want, but they are, I think, really starting to gain in power, and they have very ambitious goals. Like those guys are, those guys work hard and have pretty lofty goals for Idaho, and they're patient. They play the long game.
Thank you. How about nationally? Did it factor in nationally?
Well, nationally, Pete Hegseth is the secretary of the largest the largest department in the federal government, and he's a member of a church in the group that Doug Wilson started. I mean, that's, these guys are in power. You could argue that Pete Hegseth has the most important cabinet position in the most important country in the world. And he said that he admires Doug Wilson, and he's read his books and been inspired by them. He certainly has Christian nationalist ideas himself. So, if you're wondering if they've influenced national politics, they have, for sure. That's just one example.
Okay, great. And if we have time, maybe we'll share some others, but I do have some other questions for you. So, how does the fact that President Trump is in power then affect Christ Church, like, calculations, plans? Does that impact that? How?
Bigly.
Okay. Embellish.
No, the election, I reported this season. I reported this season in the run-up to the election. And Doug Wilson and the other Christian nationalists I talked to were keenly aware of the stakes. They thought this election was a huge opportunity for them. If Trump won, they really were ready to try to get more influence and more power at the highest levels in a way that the movement never has. And they were right. So the election happened, and almost immediately, if you're familiar with something called Project 2025, that's this kind of right-wing blueprint for government, for like radically reimagining government. And within it, there's a lot of Christian nationalist ideas, and even a bullet point that just says Christian nationalism. Like they're pretty on the nose about it. A guy named Russ Vought is one of the architects of that. He is the Office of Management and Budget Director. I hope I got the acronym right, OMB, which is this sort of position that nobody knows about in federal government unless you're a political junkie. That is hugely important. So now he's not directly with Doug Wilson. We're talking about Doug Wilson, but he's a Christian nationalist, and he immediately got a position of power. We've seen a lot of Christian nationalist ideals just right away be mainstreamed. I mentioned Pete Hegseth. Obviously, he would not be the Secretary of Defense without that. So this election gave them an opportunity. Christ Church almost immediately opened a church in D.C. And their idea is they have a footprint in D.C. because they want to influence national politics more directly now. And they probably will. I mean, they already are. So yeah, I mean, it changed everything. These guys would still be working on their goals if Trump hadn't won, but I think their timeline just moved up a lot. They're patient, they play the long game, but they see an opening right now, and I think they see this 4-year window, at least for now, we'll see, but a 4-year window to really get a lot accomplished, and I think we're gonna see them make a big play.
Okay, thank you. I want to spend just a few more minutes before we get to some questions. So if anybody has questions that you haven't had a chance to write down, you want to, you can pass them to the ends, and here in about 5 or 10 minutes we can get to questions. But and I'm going to ask you at the end if there's anything else. So if I miss something you still want to say before questions, feel free. But I want to go back to something we talked about right at the beginning. It sounds like it's really important to separate Christian nationalism from believing in Jesus and from Christianity. And so you've kind of already talked about how Christian nationalists view other people who would consider themselves Christians. But can you tell us about the other direction? Are there about Christians who oppose this movement, and kind of what's, maybe I don't know if this is the right way to say it. I feel like, hey, this is hijacking Christianity for something that that I'm against, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I would say the most vociferous opposition to Christian nationalism is from Christians. And if you listen to the podcast, most of the people I talk to who oppose Christian nationalism are Christians, and I think they certainly have the most powerful platform to talk about it, right? They're fellow Christians, and they're telling me that this doesn't represent their faith as they see it. So yes, there's a lot of Christians who do oppose this, and a lot of Christian scholars who have done some interesting scholarly work on Christian nationalism, even up to Francis Collins, like one of the most famous scientists in the world, who's also a devout Christian. He shows up in an episode where I talk to him, and he's very worried about Christian nationalism and doesn't think it represents his faith. So yes, and one of the things they told me is that they hope more Christians will speak out because they think that's more powerful than. I mean, it's obviously more powerful than an avowed atheist saying, "I don't like Christian nationalism." Like that's to be expected.
Sure. Have they had success in pushing back against it? And any examples you can think of?
I'm trying to think of a concrete example. I mean, I do think there is success. I think they have had success. I think sometimes it's intangible. But I mean, one thing that's a fact is that the ideas of the Christian nationalists I talk to are broadly unpopular in America. I mean, you heard the groans here when I said they want to disenfranchise women. I think there's pretty bipartisan consensus that women should be able to vote. I don't think that's a Republican or Democrat issue. And I think there's pretty bipartisan consensus that people should be able to hold office, whatever their beliefs are. Like, I think so I think when Americans hear about these ideas, a lot of them are not into it. But I also think a lot of Americans don't really understand what Christian nationalism is. And like you said at the beginning, some people might think, well, I'm Christian, I'm a patriot. Is that me? And maybe that's partly, I don't know, maybe that's partly the fault of people like me using the term. Maybe the term's confusing, I don't know. But I do think when people hear about their beliefs, a lot of them are turned off. And the Christian nationalists I talk to know that. Like, I do sense that they do try to sort of soften the pitch. And part of it's, with these shows where guys are smoking cigars and drinking whiskey and frankly, like, seem pretty cool and fun. And it's good packaging, but like when you scratch the surface, it's like, oh, wait, okay, but my life's going to change radically here under you guys.
Great, thank you. Well, we're about ready for questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add or kind of thoughts you'd like to finish before we get to some questions?
Well, actually, should we, before we get to the questions, if we have like a minute and a half,
yes.
Should we play the trailer?
Yeah, yeah. Let's do that.
So we got the trailer for season 2. If people haven't heard it, it's you can find it everywhere you get podcasts, as they say. And also BoiseStatePublicRadio.org. Boise State, my public radio partners on this.
I think the Christian faith is the ideal moral doctrine and principles for a thriving society. And the farther you get away from that, the more in chaos we descend.
Christian nationalists want to turn America into a theocracy, a country ruled by biblical law. So I'll tell you straight up, as a Jewish American, I hear that I can't run for office, other non-Christians can't, and I have to admit, it's a little terrifying to me.
Yeah, because your worldview is not good for society.
I spent a year inside the movement to figure out what that would mean for the rest of us. The 19th Amendment mistake.
Yeah, I think so. I really do. We will not have one Democrat president in the last 50 years if only men could vote.
I'm Heath Drusen, and in Onward Christian Soldiers, the new season of Extremely American, I talk to the fundamentalists trying to end democracy as we know it.
So theocracy is an inescapable concept.
And the people fighting against them.
I think there's probably nothing scarier for people like Wilson and Nance and all of the people in that community when the women that they have downtrodden and they've abused and they've taken away their voices and have told them that they must submit and obey actually start speaking up and telling their stories.
The new season of Extremely American from Boise State Public Radio, part of the NPR network. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
Shameless shameless plug. You ought to listen to it if you haven't. It's really fascinating. Okay, thanks for all the questions. So Chanel has kind of helped collate these, and I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. And so some of these are very similar themes. So I'm going to go with this. So to start with this, okay. So Doug Wilson, where did he get his training? Someone read that he's a self-taught theologian, and how does that play into his teachings and that sort of thing? And the other thing it sort of related is, where does the money come from? So those are two separate questions, but about Doug Wilson.
Oh, yeah. So the first question I get a lot, especially from folks who want to kind of get in the weeds on theology. He is self-taught. That is true. He did not go to seminary, which some people kind of use as, some people will bring that up as a criticism. So he's self-taught. He actually studied philosophy at University of Idaho. I asked him about that. It was pretty interesting. I talked to his old philosophy professor, who he took like every class. He took every one of his classes. Doug said basically he studied philosophy to sort of learn how the enemy, his words, thinks. So he was studying all these like Nietzsche and all these atheist philosophers, but self-taught. And where does the money come from? I'm not going to pretend that I know every detail of their finances, but they have a big publishing house. So they do make money off their media. If you want to sign up for Canon Plus, which is basically their like Christian nationalist Netflix, it's pretty expensive. I signed up for research for a year, and fortunately, thank you Boise State Public Radio for covering that. But it's pricey, and people do it, and they make money off that. They also make money off their college and their schools, right? They've got an association of schools where people pay tuition all across the country. I know I don't have like a super satisfying answer where I could be like, this like shadowy dude funds all of their stuff, because I don't, that doesn't seem to be true. They do have a lot of different businesses going.
Thank you. Okay, so I have another question. I don't know if you'd know this, but some people are interested. Do we know how the Christian nationalist movement is impacting the Magic Valley? And so that's one of the questions. And specifically, like, do we have any of Doug Wilson's educational programs in the Magic Valley? I don't know if you know that.
I'm not sure. However, they're pretty transparent about it. If you go to their website, if you go to ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, you can check if they have a school in your area. I'll be 100% honest. I don't know if they have a Magic Valley school. They definitely do in the Treasure Valley. So I don't know. As far as how they're influencing Magic Valley politics, I'd love to talk to some of you guys about that and learn more. But I mean, you do have some representatives who I would say have Christian nationalist ideals. I don't know what their specific affiliations are, but I mean, I think you've seen that grow across Idaho in the legislature. People who, if not explicitly Christian nationalists, certainly are espousing some of the ideals.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions about empathy and tolerance. So there's a church in Hagerman, a sign says, tolerance is not a Christian value. And why are Christian nationalists so scared of empathy? Why do they call empathy a sin?
Right, the sin of empathy. That's actually a book by Joe Rigney, I believe, who's part of Doug Wilson's part of his universe. Why do they hate empathy? Well, basically, what they're saying is that part of it is like relating to people who aren't, in their view, Christian enough, is taking you away from the right religious path. That's part of it. Basically, empathizing with people who are not doing the right thing in their minds will send you down the wrong path. That's a short way to put it. I know we have a lot of questions, so but yeah, it's a big thing. Like, you will see, if you go down that rabbit hole, empathy is a huge buzzword for them, and it's not a good one.
Okay, thank you. Several questions have to do with the term white Christian nationalism, how Christian nationalism, and that maybe there are different flavors or branches of Christian nationalism, but how they feel about people of color, interracial marriages, that kind of thing, LGBTQ. Sorry, that was the next question.
Okay.
Color.
We'll save that last one for the next one and start with...
Yeah, sorry about that.
Just because it's a little bit of a separate thing.
For sure, I didn't mean for it to be the same. I just kept reading.
So I shy away from the term white Christian nationalism. I know a lot of people use it. I think part of the problem is it ignores the nuances in the movement. One of the more prominent people in Doug Wilson's orbit is David Shannon, who goes by Chocolate Knox on the show he does with Gabe Wrench, and he's black. So is it a pretty white world? Yes. Are there very prominent people in it who aren't white? Also yes. Are they explicitly white supremacists? No. And I know some people get mad at me when I say that, but I think it's important to understand their goal is theocracy. Their goal isn't, they might have some really offensive ideas, and they do, and I'll mention them right now. Doug Wilson co-wrote a pamphlet whitewashing slavery, saying that the antebellum South was the most racially harmonious society in history. I mean, I'll watch my language here, but I don't have to both sides that as a journalist. That's BS. That's just not true. There was slavery, and it was based on one thing, and that was your race. So, he has said very offensive things, obviously. That is offensive. But as opposed to, a neo-Nazi's reason for being is white supremacy. That's different than what Christian nationalists are doing. There are white supremacist Christian nationalists, but it's not the whole movement. Does that make sense? Nuance is important. It's totally dead in 2025, but it's still important. Thank
you. And by the way, great questions. I'm doing my best to sort of collate and get everything. A lot of these are very similar. So we had a couple questions about how Christian nationalists feel about LGBTQ people. Not good. Can you be more specific?
I know.
I'm just teasing.
No, I mean they want to criminalize being gay. They want to criminalize the LGBTQ community in total. And I talked to them at length about that, and it's interesting. They sort of tried to soften it. They're like, well, it's not like we're going to be knocking on doors all the time, enforcing this. But I'm like, but it will be illegal, right, to openly be gay. Well, yeah. So, yes, they would criminalize being gay. They're very open about that. And pride parades would be illegal. So there's your sort of First Amendment thing. They talk about free speech a lot and how important it is, but I don't think they really believe in it. They don't, because they say it. But yeah, no, they have pretty severe views on people, on the LGBTQ community, and I don't think it would be much fun to live under their ideal America if you were.
Okay, thank you. Several questions have to do with the legislature, our legislature now, and so one question says, I've heard and seen posts from my current legislators proudly proclaiming they are Christian nationalists. Some have said if there are progressive clergy or legislators who are progressive Christians, how do you engage the state government as effectively as conservative Christians have recently maybe that, I don't know if that's exactly related, but or what advice would you give to a candidate with a Christian nationalist opponent? So the politics of when. There's a lot of questions. I don't know.
No, that's okay.
Get comment on that somehow.
So the first one was if you're a progressive clergy, how do you engage?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. If you're in Idaho, whether you're a progressive clergy or a progressive garbage man or a progressive anything, you're probably not going to have as much sway in the legislature because, I mean, it's a very conservative legislature. So, yeah, I mean, I think realistically, yeah, you won't have as much sway. As far I'm not going to give political advice, mostly because I'm a journalist, but also because you don't want political advice from me, because I don't think I would be very good at that. So yeah, I fighting running against a Christian nationalist opponent, that's not really my world. The only thing I would say is that I think one of the things we sometimes lose perspective on is that a lot of these ideas are broadly unpopular, right? I mean, there's a lot of polling out there on this too. Like when you look at polling across Republican and Democrat lines, like these ideas are not popular. And it's easy to forget that sometimes because these voices are pretty loud and are gaining sway. But yeah, if we voted on women not being able to vote, like I think the vast majority of America would say, yeah, no, we need to keep that.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, that was a really clumsy question, but I thought you did a great job, so thank you. Idaho has some of the most restrictive abortion rights in the country. Has Christian nationalism influenced that? Is that, well, the question specifically says, has Christian nationalism already infiltrated our state government? But let's just say, has it influenced that? Is that an issue that Christian nationalism?
I mean, surely it's probably helped push that forward. But I'm not going to sit here and say in Idaho that without Christian nationalism, we wouldn't have a severe restriction on abortion. Maybe it pushed over the top a little, like, more restrictions and got more people to, not want to make an exception, not want to make exceptions. But I think with or without Christian nationalism in a state like Idaho and a legislature like Idaho, then we'd probably be in a similar boat.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions about women. So, for example, did you interview a woman who was a Christian nationalist on your podcast, and did she agree with the men, or did the women agree with the men about like not voting, etc.?
Yes and yes. The last part, I'll be honest. Stupid me. I don't know if we asked her about household voting. I don't know if we asked her about should you be disenfranchised. That would have been a good question. But we did. We did talk to a Christian nationalist woman who's actually in Doug Wilson's church, works at his college. She's an accomplished writer. She writes Christian fantasy. And she was great. She answered all of our questions. Like Lord of the Rings kind of fantasy. Where is your mind? Yeah, like Lord of the Rings type stuff, but from a Christian perspective. And yeah, I mean, I encourage you to listen because it's my podcast. But I think her interview is really interesting. And yeah, she says she's very happily living in this world and in this role where her husband is the boss. Now she's also in a marriage where she has a lot of autonomy and she gets to have a pretty prestigious academic job at this college as well and write books. And I don't know their finances, but they seem to be a family that has the means to be able to do these things. That life probably looks pretty different in a different situation. But she talked to us. It's not like she had a minder with her or anything. Yeah, it'd be interesting, I think, for you to hear her perspective too. That's why we included it.
Great, thank you. So some questions about people who love the Bible, who have been labeled far right because they hold the Bible in one hand, the Constitution in the other, and want maybe some more clarity about far right versus Christian nationalists. Those are two different things. Or how are they different?
So I think far right is just a broader term. Like all Christian nationalists, I would say, are far right, just by definition. But all far right actors are not Christian nationalists. What does far right mean? Again, I think reasonable people can disagree on that. It's a somewhat messy term. I certainly have used it a lot. But I think, far right is sort of out of the traditional conservative mainstream as part of it, and wanting more, more radical right-wing change in the country, such as theocracy, like Christian nationalists. But yeah, far right is just a broader term, whereas Christian nationalism is a very specific movement.
Okay, thank you. So, a couple of related questions. How is Christian nationalism different from the Taliban, or is Christian nationalism like The Handmaid's Tale?
So I myself have spoken to the Taliban many times because I used to work in Afghanistan as a journalist. They were very easy to reach, actually. So I do actually have a lot of experience with being in a country where there was a religious fundamentalist, at that time opposition, as we know now, the government again. I'm not going to say that Christian nationalists are the same as the Taliban, because they're not. Obviously, the Taliban is they're an Islamic movement. A lot of Muslims would say a perversion of Islam. Certainly, I have a lot of friends from Afghanistan at the time who are horrified by the Taliban and themselves were devout Muslims. But look, I think you also can't pretend that there's no overlap. The Taliban runs the country by their strict interpretation of the Quran. Christian nationalists want to run our country by their strict interpretation of the Bible. And again, it's important to remember it's their interpretation, not necessarily yours. So of course it wouldn't be the same, right? Of course the Taliban has some different views and more extreme views on women, like no question. But yeah, but there's some overlap there. Certainly with fundamentalist governments that we see in Iran, that we see in Afghanistan, that we see in Saudi Arabia. Those governments don't treat women very well, and we've talked at length now about what Christian nationalists think of women's role in society. It wouldn't be the same, but it certainly would be unequal.
Great, thanks. Here's a question. I'm just going to read it. Statewide media denigrates Christ Church and Pastor Wilson quite regularly. Is this jealousy? Assuming they've followed the law, shouldn't they be celebrated?
I don't think following the law means anybody should be celebrated. I don't think I should be celebrated just for not going to jail. So I don't think I denigrated Pastor Wilson. I don't think I denigrated Christ Church, to be honest. In fact, I got a lot of criticism from the left saying I let them talk too much. I sat down with Pastor Wilson for probably 5 hours. And I let him talk a lot in there. If you came away from it thinking they were being denigrated, then perhaps you don't actually like what they're doing, because in my podcast, they speak for themselves. Now, a victim of abuse also speaks for herself, and she has criticisms of them based on lived experience and things that happened to her that Doug Wilson doesn't actually deny. So Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's denigration. I think I just kind of described what they were doing, and if it sounded bad, well, it came mostly from them. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Here's a question I don't know if you'd know the answer to, but regarding one of tonight's sponsors, MWAG, what is this group's mission and purpose, and what is their interest in Christian nationalism? I'm wondering, maybe you probably don't know that.
I have no idea.
Could Cindy answer that?
Sorry.
Where's Cindy? Could you answer that for us? You want to come down? Sure, that's if you can speak loud. Okay, come on over.
Thank you for the question. Mormon Women for Ethical Government is an association of women who believe in four main objectives: faithful, peaceful, nonpartisan, proactive. And our work is to protect the Constitution of the United States. We believe in the government that was created by our founders. We want to support that government, and we want to uphold the laws that are listed there. Because of that, we are active in many different arenas, always in a very nonpartisan way. We have a website. I would direct you to that. It is MormonWomenForEthicalGovernment.org, and MWEG.org will get you there as well. And I'd be happy to stay and answer any personal questions you might have about it after this forum tonight.
Okay, thank you. Gave you a break and a chance to get a drink.
That's great.
Okay, so where was I? The couple of questions that had to do with other movements, and so like, how does Christ Church specifically integrate with other, or is it in competition? Are there other Christian nationalist movements? Does it have anything to do with other conservative Christian church denominations? Specifically, this one asked about Southern Baptist. So any comments about how it integrates with other movements?
Yeah, there are other Christian nationalist movements that are very different, and they don't always play nice. The one group, so Southern Baptist is interesting, and that's kind of a whole other topic, but there's a real like schism going on with Southern Baptist, and there's a Christian nationalist wing that's trying to pull them much more to the right. And they kind of act like Southern Baptists are liberals, which they're not. Yeah, sorry, they're not. But those guys, the sort of the right flank of the Southern Baptist movement, have been pretty close to Doug Wilson. There's a guy named William Wolf, who's a former Trump administration official, who's a pretty prominent Christian nationalist, who's leading that. So yeah, there is overlap there. There's a couple other strains that are not aligned with Doug Wilson's movement, and Doug Wilson's movement's kind of this like Calvinist, like really austere kind of beliefs. The New Apostolic Reformation, that's a different Christian nationalist movement. They certainly have had some people in positions of influence in the White House. They're pretty different. The big thing that they don't agree with the Doug Wilsons of the world is that they have women as leaders in their churches, and that's a big no-no for Doug Wilson. And then you've also got the much more hard right, like kind of Nazi-adjacent Christian nationalists, and they also are not affiliated with Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson rejects those guys. But that's a whole different world. You've got some guys up in North Idaho, like Dave Riley, and a lot of them are what they call themselves traditional Catholics, Tradcaths, and that's kind of it's like a whole another world, and they're not like associated specifically with mainline Catholicism and have their own kind of beliefs. And that's not to say all Tradcaths are explicitly bigoted like that guy and some others up there, but Yeah, those are sort of three big strains in America, and they don't necessarily like play nice with each other.
Okay, great, thank you. A couple of questions about why their Christian nationalist ideas have been so persuasive to people. And one of the questions specifically says, is it power and influence they think they have, or is it they have an R after their name and the average voter is confused or misinformed? This has more to do with politics, but so if people really, if most people are out and they're in, why is the movement persuasive?
Yeah, no, good question, right. So one big thing is that, when you have 25% turnout at a primary election, then you've got a much, in general, whether it's a Democratic primary or a Republican primary, you have the much more sort of hardcore base, and a lot of times the more extreme voters, whether left or right, tend to be more regular voters. So the primary system tends to produce more extreme candidates. So it's not to say that these ideas aren't popular at all. They're obviously popular enough to get some people elected. But I would say low turnout primaries are a big reason for that. More extreme candidates have struggled in general elections in competitive districts. There just aren't that many competitive districts anymore across the country because of gerrymandering. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's one part of it. And the other part is that there's been plenty of examples where Christian nationalists have struggled in elections because of that very thing. It depends on the district. It depends on the turnout, and it also depends on voter education. I think a lot of times, yes, I think a lot of times people don't. We have busy lives. I'm not being judgmental, and we don't always get to read up as much as we want on the candidates. And if you're a straight line Republican Party voter and you see the R, you might just vote for them, just like a straight ticket Democratic voter might vote for a more extreme candidate that they don't really know much about, because that's just what they do.
Great, thanks. Here's a question. Aside from the comments about slavery in the South, do you have other examples of historical gaslighting or revisionism brought forth by the movement? I don't know, that's kind of off the top of your head.
Well, so the Civil War is a big fascination. That's kind of the main one. They explicitly say that the North were the aggressors, the South were the victims, that we shouldn't have ended slavery by force. Other historical wrongs. I can't think of a specific example, but in general, they don't want to talk about they don't want to talk about the Jim Crow South. They don't want to talk about, any number of things that we got wrong in America. And that's not just them, right? There is sort of a pushback right now to confronting our demons. And they certainly, they say they want to go back to kind of 1950s America but then they also kind of ignore the problems of 1950s America and many other eras.
Thank you. I have a question about, I don't know if you know, like, if they were in charge, what would their punishments be for breaking the law? Would they be like biblical punishments, like some of the, I won't read everything on the card, but.
They danced around that. It's a good question. They danced around that. They didn't dance around much with me. But they did dance around that a little, sort of broadly saying like the Bible will like guide us, but they didn't tell me they're going to stone people. I don't know if they would or they wouldn't. Maybe
Okay.
we'll find out.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Have you interviewed Christians not involved with Wilson who've characterized from the Bible where he's wrong? It's like cite chapter and verse.
Yes, but I'm not going to be able to remember the exact chapter and verse. I wish I had that kind of brain. But yeah, I talked to quite a few people, and I even had a panel. One of the bonus episodes is a panel of pastors And as you might imagine, a panel of pastors talked in very biblical terms. And just so you know, it wasn't all lefty pastors. One of the guys on my small panel was Owen Strachan, who's a extremely conservative Baptist, like pretty right-wing guy, but doesn't like Christian nationalism. And Doug Wilson and his crew really hates Owen. So anyway, that would be an interesting conversation, whoever asked that question or anybody else who's interested in that. You know, it's a bunch of religious leaders talking to me about the biblical case against Christian nationalism, essentially.
Great, thank you. I think we might be able to get through all these. We've just got a few minutes, and I have a few more. So, do you know if they have specific economic policy goals, like restrictions on land or business ownership, things like that kind of thing?
So nobody said restrictions on land ownership or business ownership. So I'm not totally sure about that. One thing they did keep saying, though, they were sort of telling me about all these rights that a lot of us would lose. And kind of a funny talking point that they had was, but you know what? Nobody's going to tell you, the city's not going to tell you how you can renovate your house. We're going to cut the red tape. And I'm sure there's plenty of people here who would like red tape cut and all of that. But it seemed like an odd thing to throw in there when it was like, well, sure, you're going to lose your right to vote, but when you fix your kitchen, you're not going to have an inspector come. And it was like, I don't know that you're going to sell people on that. Like, I feel like that trade-off's big.
Thank you. A couple questions about specific people. I don't know if you know, but is Matt Walsh, a Christian nationalist, also asking about J.D. Vance, who made a comment, I guess, about one household vote, if I'm reading that right. And is he a Christian nationalist, or if so, are they in a different movement? I don't know if you know that.
Matt Walsh is definitely a Christian nationalist. Oh yeah, pretty outspoken, pretty big audience. I would firmly put him in that world, and a lot of the people I spoke to for the podcast interact with him, at least online. J.D. Vance is a really fascinating case. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, so you don't need to be on the spot if you don't want to. But he made a comment about household voting, because I'm not actually aware of that. I'm sure I could have missed it.
3 or 4 years ago, and then it might change his mind when he started.
Oh, wonder what his wife thinks about that. She's a pretty accomplished woman who probably wants her vote, but I don't know. So J.D. Vance, thank you for the question. J.D. Vance is a really interesting case because he's Catholic. And maybe he doesn't know this, but they do not think that a practicing Catholic who's following all of the rules and adhering to what the Pope says, they do not consider them Christian. They think they've strayed. They were specific about that with me. I asked Doug Wilson. So it's interesting because J.D. Vance, is he a Christian nationalist? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I probably wouldn't put him in that category right now. But a lot of Christian nationalists recently have been pretty high on J.D. Vance. And I think it's a pragmatic thing because I know some of these guys. And I literally know these guys from my reporting. And I know they don't think Catholics are proper Christians. So it's fascinating. I'm curious to see if that honeymoon ends, because there's certainly some irreconcilable differences there.
Thank you. This is a very short question, but it might get to some other issues. We have a few minutes, but are you afraid for your life?
Should I be?
When I first saw that, I was like, "Oh no!" But I think it's a real sincere question.
I appreciate that. I'm not afraid for my life, but I am cognizant that it's a potentially dangerous time to be a journalist, and I'm covering stuff that people get extremely emotional and like have strong feelings about. Yeah, it's a concern. It's not something it's something that's on my mind from time to time, for sure. So, yeah, I wouldn't go as far as saying I'm like afraid for my life. I think if I was like really worried about an imminent threat, I wouldn't be here.
Could you maybe touch on that Doug Wilson has not expressed like physical violence? He's not promoting that, but
no.
Maybe some in the movement do, but he doesn't, right?
He doesn't. No, he doesn't. Doug Wilson, as far as I know, has never advocated for violence. He uses these like military terms and sort of like warlike language for some things, but no, I don't think he's advocated for violence. I've gotten some nasty notes. You know, you should get your teeth kicked in. You know, if you keep talking about blah blah blah, then like we can figure out where you are. That kind of stuff, cryptic stuff. Not a ton, but yeah, enough to be on my mind a little bit. Yeah, it's a bad atmosphere for journalists right now. Whatever your politics are. If somebody is, if somebody's advocating harm to journalists or like, you know, making them out to be treasonous, that's pretty dangerous language. And there's people who will act on that. And don't do that, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is the last question I have, but then I have a question for you to wrap up with. But here's the last question from the audience I have. What do you feel is the biggest motivating factor for Christian nationalists to basically move away from traditional, quote unquote, traditional Christian or Protestant values and more towards ideas of religious extremism?
What's their biggst motivation
to
move
away?
away?
Why do people attracted to the movement? Maybe is another way to say that.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, one thing about if you live in Doug Wilson's world, I keep saying Doug Wilson, but if you live in this like Christian nationalist world, this kind of severe view of society where everything is sort of set and roles are clearly defined, I think there is a comfort, right? Like you have a blueprint for life, and you've got clearly defined. There's no gray areas in that world. You don't have to think about messy things. Yeah, I think there is a draw to that. The other thing they've done really well is, again, they've made their movement like a counterculture thing, right? It's like the 60s completely flipped on its head, where these are the guys who are fighting the man. That's how they portray themselves. COVID helped them a lot. You know, they made themselves out to be the rebels. And you know, I mean, they were in a certain sense of the word, for sure. So I think that's helped. And again, slick marketing. I mean, their shows are good. They're engaging. They look good. You know, they're well produced, and yeah, I mean, that helps. Like, they've got people on there who seem cool.
Great. No, thank you. I want to thank the audience for the great questions. I appreciate Chanel kind of collating those. I read all of them. I did my best to sort of collate them, and I really appreciate the thoughtful questions. And I really appreciate, Heath, you coming. I want to ask one more question, but then I want to give you the last word. So anyway, thank you so much for coming, and then I hope we'll hold our applause till after you're done, because I know we're going to want to clap for you. But just appreciate everybody being here and participating in this. So I have a question for you. What would you say to people who feel like there's this sort of, oh my goodness, there's this inevitable momentum of Christian nationalism? Is there this nihilism, like, what can I do? If someone doesn't feel comfortable with this movement and wants it to be different, could that be a thought you could leave us with, just like something around that?
Yeah, I would say whatever your views are right now, if you think Christian nationalism is horrible and a terrible threat to democracy, if you think it's pretty great, either way, or somewhere in the middle, this is the time to be engaged, whatever you think. I think there's an idea that like the country's on some inevitable trajectory, and the fact is that everybody still has agency. We still have a democracy. We get to vote. It's a closely divided country, and I think there's still a lot of stuff we broadly agree on. So yeah, this is the time. I think this is the time for all of us to be civically engaged. I mean, you should always be, but you know, right now, I think this is an incredibly important turning point in the country, and nothing's inevitable. And yeah, I mean, things can be more inevitable if there's a 15% turnout in your local election. So yeah, I would say like whatever your belief system, you should be fighting for it right now because everything's in play, and there is no inevitability.
Thanks, Heath. Thanks for your great podcast, and thanks for being with us here in Twin Falls tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.